How's it going, guys? Todd from Toddtronics. Today I wanted to talk about the original ROG Ally. Now, I know that we have the Ally X, and a lot of the things that we're going to be doing in today's upgrade video are things that just happen to be already on that device. However, a lot of people own this device or have the ability to pick one up very cheap on the secondhand market. For example, I was able to make a trade for this device here, and I would value the trade that I made at around or under $400. Now, the main thing that I did not like about the ROG Ally when it came out, aside from the $700 price point, was the fact that the battery life on this thing was just absolutely terrible. It had a 40 watt hour battery, but the system itself would be drawing well over 30 watts in just regular usage if I was in the higher turbo modes, which is something that I would frequently want to do because this thing was so expensive that I was hoping to get more performance out of it. Another thing that I didn't really love about this device, and it kind of goes along with the other handhelds that are out there, but you could only upgrade the SSD in here with something like a 2230 SSD, and those tend to be quite a bit more expensive than something like your full-size NVMe drives, which are 2280. But we were able to get an adapter that we're going to put in here today that is going to fix that problem, as well as a 74 watt-hour battery that is going to revolutionize the way that I use this thing. I no longer have battery anxiety, and honestly, it was a pretty seamless install. You do have to kind of cut some things, and we'll get into that, but it wasn't anything too terrifying. And lastly, the ergonomics on this thing was something that I just absolutely did not like, but adding grips and things like that always felt like it added a bit too much weight. And now we have these amazing clip-on grips, which actually really make this thing feel similar to a Steam Deck. And being someone that uses a Steam Deck OLED as my main handheld, it has a lot to look up to as far as ergonomics if it's going to be competing with that. Now, lastly, I do want to state that this isn't necessarily a tutorial on how to do any of these things. There will be tutorials that I can link maybe down below that are a little bit longer and more in depth for each individual mod. However, most of the things that we do here today were pretty straightforward and not too taxing or hard to do at all. So if it's something that you're interested in, I will also leave links down below to where I got these parts. But without further ado, let's get into the video. Now, when it comes to the adapter for the SSD, there's quite a lot of different ones that you can pick from. I picked this one mainly because it was advertised as being PCIe Gen 4 compatible, and I just like the fact that it had a black PCB. Now, for the drive that we're going to be putting in this thing, this is from a company called FixWatt. This is PCIe Gen 4 compatible and 2 terabytes. It's nothing special. I've used these drives in the past, so I mean, it's up to you what you want to do, if you want to buy a name brand one or if you want to go with one of these more budget-oriented ones, but I haven't had any issues with it in the past. We're also going to be installing the JSAUX RGB transparent backplate, and we'll go into why that is later. You don't necessarily have to do that, but for me personally, it's just going to make things a little easier. And for resetting up Windows after you put in that new drive, you are going to want something with USB-C that's going to allow you to be able to connect a keyboard and mouse, because you're going to get into a certain point where you need to enter prompts into Windows, and you're not going to have a keyboard to be able to do that. Now, taking apart the ROG Ally is actually pretty easy. There's just 6 screws here on the back. All of them are the same size except for the bottom center one, which is a bit smaller. You do need to go around the corners with a pry tool. However, I did buy this second hand, and the last person that owned it did open it up before, so mine actually came apart very easily, but it's not anything too scary to try to get inside of. Now that we're inside of the device, we can take a look here. You're gonna have to remove this little black piece of paper that you see in the center. That's gonna be where the drive is hiding behind. So you just peel that up, stick that off to the side, and as you can see here, we have that 2230 tucked right in there. It is a little bit hard to get out the first time you try to get it out. You might have to do a little bit of wiggling. And the one thing that I want to point out is this new adapter is going to be kind of sitting over top of the battery terminal. So you do just want to be a little bit careful. Unplug your battery before you do anything. You do have to lift up a little bit of a tab here, and then you can just pull it straight back. But just take your time, be very careful. You don't want to break this. I didn't have any issues, but again, those little tabs there, you're gonna have to pull them up before the battery terminal will be free. And of course, you always want to just try to discharge any remaining power on the device by just holding down the power button for about 10 seconds or so, just to be sure that everything in there is completely drained. Now, taking out this here again, I mentioned it's in there pretty snug, so you have to wiggle it around a little bit to get it out. It can be a little bit of a challenge, but just take your time. It won't be anything that you can't do. Now that we have this here, we can just set it off to the side and begin installing the adapter. Now you're going to want to install your drive onto the adapter, but I just wanted to do a quick test fit here just to kind of see where everything would line up. And again, one thing I did not love is we have that metal piece on the adapter just sitting right over the battery terminal. So I'm going to show you in a bit what I did to kind of mitigate some of that stress that I had about potentially shorting out my device or having any sort of issues. So now I have the drive attached to the adapter, and it does screw on right there to the bottom. So that screw is going to be hovering right over that battery terminal. So what I advise you do is pick up a roll of Kapton tape. So this can be bought pretty cheap on Amazon, and what it's going to do is add as an insulator between the metal components while they rest on top of each other, just so that way you don't have to worry. It's super easy to do, and it's always good just to have some lying around anytime that you're going to be messing with electronics. Now it fits in there a little snug, and there's not really a good way with this particular adapter to secure it down. But again, I'm not really too worried about it. I think once we have the backplate on there, everything should be fine. And if you really were worried, you could take some of that tape and maybe tape it down a little bit more. Now we're going to prep for the JSAUX backplate. So we have to remove the extra macro buttons as well as the triggers. Be careful when you're removing the screws on the extra buttons here, because they do have little springs that are ready to pop out as soon as that screw gets loose, and you definitely don't want to lose those. So once you get those taken off, you're going to transfer those over to the new shell. And the main reason why we're actually swapping shells is because there's all this extra bit of plastic here on the bottom half of the OEM shell that would get in the way with that new battery modification. Now you technically can trim all this off if you want to, but just to be safe and to have a smoother process, I went with the JSAUX RGB backplate, plus it just looks cool. I'm going to leave out all of the RGB accessories on my build just to leave a little bit more room for airflow, and because we have that larger drive going in. And as I get this thing taken out, I'll kind of show you the differences between this plate versus the regular one. As you can see, we have all that extra plastic on the bottom, and here it's completely smoothed out. So that way there's less potential chance of something maybe puncturing the battery or causing it to not fit as flush as we would like. Now we just have to transfer over the triggers, which is pretty easy to do. Just take your time, make sure you're not bending any of the metal or anything like that when you're trying to pull these out, and make sure you take your time to line everything up so that way it feels good the first time, because it would be a pain to have to go back in after you do all these modifications. And one small piece of advice that I could give you is just do one trigger at a time, so that way you kind of have a reference on how it should feel. So here I am comparing back and forth between the one that I hadn't transferred over and the one that I already did. Once everything felt good, I was able to validate that I did everything correctly. We were able to move on to the next step, which was just putting on those extra macro buttons. For some reason in my head, I could not figure out how they were oriented at first. You do have to kind of pop them through, and once you get them popped into the other side, just be extra careful when you're putting the spring down with the screw that everything lines up and feels good. Now, the next thing that we're going to have to do is cover this light sensor that's here. Because the original ROG backplate is not translucent, you don't have to worry about it. Every time you open this device up, like I mentioned before, though, this little sensor is going to trip and not allow you to power on the device without using an AC adapter. But just covering this up with this simple little sticker that they include in the box is more than enough to do the trick. And here you can see they do include a little sticker to cover the battery, because the battery itself is silver and just doesn't look all that aesthetically pleasing. I'm going to put this on just to showcase you guys what it will look like. However, we are planning on changing out this battery shortly. But just to give you an idea, if you were planning on stopping at this point in the video, that they do give you this, just be very careful, because it is going to stick to those ribbon cables. So if you ever have to take it up in the future, just make sure you don't tear those ribbon cables along with it. And because we no longer have an operating system, because this is a fresh drive, we're going to want to hold the volume down button and power. Keep holding volume down until you get into the BIOS screen. It'll take a few seconds here. Just be patient. Keep holding that down. Once you enter into the BIOS, you're going to want to hit Y and then tab over to Advanced and click Cloud Recovery. It's the first option under Advanced. Now, this part will take quite a while, so make sure you set aside about an hour, upwards to 2 if you have a slower internet connection. Just follow the prompts along. Eventually, you're going to get to a point where you need to put in your Wi-Fi password. And for this, you're going to need a keyboard, and that's where that adapter that I was talking about earlier will come into play. Now that your Wi-Fi password is typed in, you're not going to need to type anything for quite a while, so I'd highly recommend you just connect to your AC adapter. Now, a few days have passed, and I actually received the battery modification in the mail, as well as these clip-on ergonomic grips that I am an absolute huge fan of. These things don't really add any weight to the device, but they really do make it a lot more comfortable. And again, they clip on from the front and the back, so they're really sturdy. But let's get into it. I'm so excited to see if this battery modification can make a big difference in the way that I use this device, because again, I love having the extra power, but if it comes at the cost of being tethered to the wall, it kind of feels pointless, you know? So let's take a peek at what you get into the battery kit. As you can see here, it has got the battery itself, and they give you a couple of tools because this actually is designed for the ROG Ally. So it's a 74 watt hour battery. We have a little bit of Teflon heat shrink tape that I'll explain a little bit later. They give you some flesh cutting pliers for trimming the shell, and they give you a little bit of padding to put around the device to keep that battery extra safe. Again, this is 74 watt hours. There is another kit out there by JSAUX. That one's only 65 watts. It does seem like it's a little bit easier to put into the device, but for me, I really wanted to maximize the amount of battery life that I got out of this thing. And since I got this kit straight from Amazon, I felt like there was no harm, no foul. If it didn't work out, I'd have an easy route to return it. Now, getting into the device, there's one thing I want to point out. If you did use that little sticker earlier, just be very careful when you're taking it off as to not tear this ribbon cable, because once it gets stuck onto it, it's actually on there pretty good. So just take your time peeling that up. Make sure you secure the ribbon cable in place so that way it's not getting yanked or pulled. And then just pop open those clips here at the top and remove that ribbon cable so that way it's not going to get in your way while you're removing the battery. Next, we're going to take out the SSD that we installed earlier, and it seems like that Kapton tape did a good job. We're going to pop up those clips on the battery here, so that way we can free the battery terminal. Just pull up, again, be gentle, take your time, and we have 3 screws around the device that we have to undo in order to free this thing. So I'm going to start with the one here on the left side, move over to the one on the right, and then the last one is going to be hidden over here in the bottom right-hand corner. And once you get all the screws out, it should be now free to remove. However, I want to warn you, always be careful when moving batteries out of devices not to bend them or poke them. Make sure that you get it set out of the way and secure from anything sharp that could poke or prod it. And I do want to point out that this new battery does sit over the RAM, but they have included this Teflon heat shielding. And so that should help protect a little bit against that. Now we do have to trim out these 2 squares that are over here, and that's why they give you those flush cutters. I do believe with the JSAUX mod, you may not have to do any of that trimming, but I'm not 100% certain. But just take your time, be very careful, make sure that you're not cutting any of the PCB or any of the ribbon cables. Just go nice and slow. And right here, my light decided to die on me and it startled me really bad. But again, just make sure you get those pieces cut down nice and flush. Unfortunately, I lost the footage of cutting the right side. Now, the next step here is there's these 2 little squares at the top. We're going to add a bit of foam that's included in the kit, and that's just going to help the battery sit slightly above that RAM module, and that way it's not poking directly against that harsh plastic. So first you're going to want to do is pull this little Teflon sponge off of the PCB where it sits and just move it directly underneath, so that way it has something to sit on, but it lowers it just a little bit. And they give you the foam that I mentioned before. You're going to want to cut to size just so it's just barely sticking out above it, just so it protects it from against that plastic. So here I am just being very careful to make sure that I measure a good amount. Again, take your time. Double, triple check if you have to. They give you more than enough foam, so that way if you mess up, you could go back in and maybe make some other pieces. But it's really just there to provide some cushioning against that plastic and to kind of give it something to help it hover a little bit above that RAM module there, because that RAM module is going to produce a little bit of heat, but I'm not too concerned. Now at this point, I have the battery plugged in. Remember to close that latch so that way the battery terminal is secure. And I'm putting on the back ribbon cable for the left and right side boards here. Again, just be careful. Make sure that everything feels like it fits in a good spot. It's not being pushed down by anything, that there's nothing poking it. If you have to go back and trim a little bit more, then do it. Just take your time here. Again, this is not something you really want to play with. Batteries can be kind of dangerous, so you just really, really want to be careful. And that goes for putting on the back plate as well. If anything feels like it needs to be forced, or the clips aren't going in, or there's some sort of bulge somewhere, then stop what you're doing, go back, readjust, and make sure that everything fits the way that it should. One thing I really love about this clear plate is you can actually see the 74 watt hour on the battery label through this shell. And as you can see here in a moment, it has life. We successfully swapped the battery and everything is working. Oh man, this is such an amazing feeling. And if you take a look at battery info viewer, we have the 75 watt hours. It's fully charging. It seems to be charging with the fast charging speed, and there are 0 cycles on this battery, which is exciting. Now, the last thing I wanted to do was put on these little clip-on grips that I talked about briefly in the video. I'll leave these linked down below. I got these on Amazon, but out of all of the solutions that I've tried to make this device more comfortable, this one is by far my favorite. And again, the most important thing for me was that it felt really good, but also didn't add a ton of weight to the device. And this gives it a near Steam Deck-like feeling. You just have to clip in these 2 pieces front to back. It can be a little bit troubling the first few times. And the only concern that I have is that you probably won't be able to take these on and off a bunch of times without eventually breaking one of those clips. But it does help it to feel nice and secure and that it's not sliding around anywhere once they're on there. It's just a super nice, comfortable feeling. It gives it a lot more room, and it kind of fits in with the aesthetic and the vibe that we got going on here with this backplate. They do have little cutouts so that way it's not blocking the vent. And now we finally have the ultimate ROG Ally Z1 Extreme. Now, off camera, I went ahead and set up a dual boot system. So I partitioned my drive into 1 terabyte for Bazzite and 1 terabyte for Windows, just so that way I could keep the maximum amount of compatibility, but also have the ease of use of the Steam OS that Bazzite provides. I'm going to leave links down below to some of my friends' guides on how to set up that dual boot, because I do think it's something that really transforms the user experience. So if that's something you're into, make sure you check the links in the description down below. I want to thank everybody that made it this far into the video. If you're new here, please consider hitting the subscribe button down below. And I want to hear from you guys in the comments. Do you think that if you already had an ROG Ally, these mods would be enough to really breathe some new life into it? Or would this even steer you in the direction of picking up a cheap one secondhand or open box somewhere? Let me know down below in the comments. And again, I want to thank everyone that watched this video. We will do a follow-up in a few months' time once I've had some time to really use this battery and put it through its paces. But the initial first impressions are very good. We'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.